Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Our introduction will be from Mike Coburn, Research America's COO.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. The webinar today is the Fogarty Center, How Americans Benefit from Global Health Research. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Today's webinar will be recorded. All non-speaker lines have been muted to minimize excess noise. You will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing it into the question panel. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and try to address as many possible questions during the Q&A session at the end of today's session. I would like to briefly introduce our four speakers today. Their bios, along with several fact sheets, are available in the webinar documents box, and I welcome our panelists today, which include Dr. Roger Glass, Director of the Fogarty Center at NIH, Dr. Chris Beyrer, and Dr. Bob Bollinger, both from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and also Christine Lubinski, Vice President for Global Health at the Infectious Disease Society of America. Thank you all for joining us on our call today, and I will now turn the webinar over to Dr. Glass.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thanks to IDSA, to Research America, and to the Association for Tropical Medicine. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Roger Glass, the Director of the Fogarty International Center and the Associate Director of NIH for Global Health. And I really want to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about Fogarty and about the activities in which we're engaged. You know, we really, in health, we share a common destiny with everyone around the world. And as we see in the next slide, in the next slide, there are outbreaks that occur. Diseases know no borders. And just in the past couple of weeks, we've seen this new outbreak of Ebola in the Congo, cholera in Yemen, bird flu in China. So these things are always going to be with us. How are we going to be able to respond in advance? How are we going to develop the diagnostics and the tools that need to be developed so we can protect ourselves and our colleagues now and also into the future? And I think that's the challenge, and one of the main challenges that Fogarty is attempting to address. The Fogarty Center at NIH is one of the 27 centers and institutes at NIH engaged in biomedical research. It's the largest biomedical research funder in the world. At Fogarty, our mission is to promote training and capacity building for research, specifically in the international arena, and to develop networks and partnerships between U.S. and foreign institutions so we can accomplish these goals. Our budget's about $54 million a year, most for extramural programs. We have about 500 active grants, and it covers a diversity of fields from HIV and infectious diseases to the non-communicable diseases, health, learning, trauma, as you can see, and really the development of institutional collaborations between U.S. and foreign institutions, which are long-lasting and really are a major part of health diplomacy for us as well, building out the frontiers of science around the world so the U.S. maintains its position as a real leader in global health research. Our programs are really designed to protect the health and safety of Americans at home today and into the future. Our activities for diagnostics, drugs, developments, ideas really contribute to the U.S. economy in real ways. We provide the foundation for NIH research institutes, all 27 of them, to conduct research abroad, which means that they have to have in place opportunities for good ethical research, for research management, and for people who are well-trained and networked between the U.S. and those foreign institutions, and ultimately forging international partnerships which allow us to really amplify and extend the reach of American science, but global science, and build long-lasting relationships relationships that are based on trust and accomplishments. Well, we're only as safe as the weakest link. I think in this latest outbreak of Ebola, we learned something very important. You know, in West Africa, we had a limited number of activities and research activities in those countries that were affected by the Ebola outbreak, and the consequences of that were really quite evident. At the same time, there were introductions of Ebola patients in many of the neighboring countries: Mali, Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, and the Congo. And in each of those, there was enough knowledge, structure, laboratory capability, networking of people, knowing who to call when they had problems, that allowed those countries to deal with an introduction of new cases, to call people for help, to enact contact tracing immediately and public health measures to prevent the outbreak. In those three countries that were most affected, it cost us over $2 billion to contain the epidemic. So we really, if we had spent more on prevention, if we had built the infrastructure in advance, as we had in those other countries, not necessarily for Ebola, but for infectious diseases in general, for AIDS, for other infectious diseases, we would have been much better off. We would have spent much less money. Infrastructure was clearly important. Well, Fogarty, our programs benefit the U.S. scientists and U.S. institutions, and it may not be clear from our name, but about 80% of our funds go to support U.S. institutions so that they can conduct their international programs, conduct research at the cutting edge and on the frontiers of science when it's abroad. And in almost all of those programs, 100% of our grants involve some U.S. scientists. So we're really supporting the U.S. research endeavor around the world. Now, our programs provide the foundation for research in many ways. I mentioned bioethics research training, and substantial portion of the NIH budget for research ethics goes to the developing world, because without a platform of research ethics, we cannot conduct good, solid, ethically firm research. There are lots of unique issues: cultural beliefs, literacy, understanding of what's needed, what a patient needs to know in order to consent themselves. How do we conduct research in an epidemic situation such as Ebola? That was a real challenge this time when vaccines were being tested and new drugs might be tested in the future. How do we study Zika, for instance, now in fetuses and pregnant women in developing world? Who can we connect with to look at brain imaging and early diagnosis? We also work on informatics and data complex, and we deal with developing lab skills, leadership ability through degree programs, and we've worked around Africa with the Medical Education Partner Initiative, an initiative which has networked more than 40 schools of medicine and health sciences to conduct research and to train the next generation of investigators. Well, let me give you some examples of how this works, and our speakers after me will give their own examples. But when we think about malaria, we work very closely with NIAID, which supports major grants and research activities on malaria. However, who in the field are capable and working on the research and conducting the research and being responsible as investigators now and into the future? This is where the Fogarty training programs are absolutely essential. And if we look at programs, for instance, in HIV/AIDS, many of the major contributions to the development of AIDS diagnostics, prevention strategies have been conducted in the field by people who have had their training through Fogarty programs and leaders who have been developed through these programs. Another example, and we work not only in the infectious diseases, but in the non-communicable diseases in much of medical research. The key biomedical problem that's going to be the most costly in a few decades will be Alzheimer's disease. And there are estimates that by 2050, the cost of care of Alzheimer's patients could exceed $1 trillion annually as our population's life expectancy is prolonged. We've identified cohorts of patients in Colombia who represent the offspring of an immigrant to Colombia in 1745 who brought a gene for early onset and rapid progression of Alzheimer's disease. Offspring of that original immigrant to Colombia now forms a nidus of a community of patients, extended family, if you will, with early onset and rapid progression of Alzheimer's. If we want to identify new biomarkers of this disease, if we want to test new drugs that might delay onset, it's within a community like this with a high prevalence of disease and rapid progression where we can really make an impact. And so we're involved now with multi-site trials of drugs to test and see if we can delay progression. We're looking at this population for biomarkers of disease. Well, this is our 50th year of the founding of Fogarty. We've had many outstanding leaders who have been developed by these programs. And you see here some quotes from many of them. But I think for all of them, by capturing young people, young investigators early in their career and giving them the skill set that they need to be incredibly important future researchers and leaders, it really makes these programs make a tremendous difference. It's a huge return on investment, especially for those leaders who stay in biomedical science and research for years to come. And here are just a few of the leaders we've developed over time, many of whom are known to you. I want to just point out a few. Marcos Espinal, right here at PAHO in Washington, was the former head of the Stop TB program of WHO. He's now the chief of the infectious disease programs at PAHO, a critical person as we deal with the Zika outbreak in Latin America. And his commentary was that his training was a defining experience in his career. It opened up my world completely, gave me another view, and I fell in love with public health and research. He did his Ph.D. at Berkeley with Art Reingold through one of our training programs. Another is Ruth Ndwati, pediatrician, chair of pediatrics in Nairobi, who trained through a Fogarty program early in her career. She said her Fogarty training had given Africans the skills we need to conduct research, document the illness, and look at possible interventions that work in Africa. Fogarty has changed the face of HIV medicine. And Eliota Tumusegwe, the Uganda's Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation, a young physician who in 1992 lost his brother to HIV and became an HIV doctor. He went on in 1998 to do a Fogarty training program at Western Reserve where he saw snow for the first time. He first used the computer and went back to become a researcher for a decade, then the Minister of Health, and today the Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation. He commented to us when we last visited that without Fogarty, he quite simply wouldn't be who he is today. For the first time in my life, I left Uganda, flew on a plane, and used a computer. Imagine the impact of his leadership in Ugandan science. Well, each year we send out through this program, one of our programs, the Fellows and Scholars program, along with the Fulbright-Fogarty program, about 93 medical students, fellows, and postdocs. About 20 are foreign fellows who are working on NIH-sponsored research. But for all of them, this is a changing point in their careers. This is a key point where in a year of mentored research, they really identify with what they would like to do in their careers and in the specialties they've chosen. They go out in almost any field. It's a mentored research experience in a developing country. Those partnerships endure for a long time. We've had, as I mentioned, collaborative activities. We've worked with the Fulbright program to have medical students go out and train, and we found that over 80% of these fellows and trainees go back and continue to work in the countries where they trained. Here's some examples. Amy Sims, a pediatric cardiologist, who took with her a small laptop sonogram to Malawi and started identifying cases of rheumatic heart disease, which have become quite uncommon in this country, cases of congenital heart defects that were never corrected, but where the patients survived to later childhood and young adulthood who could be corrected. And she began conducting research on cardiomyopathies in the field. She's going back now to set up a program in cardiology in Malawi as part of her own research career at the University of North Carolina. She said, in medical school, we're somewhat put on a path and we're expected to go straight to the next step in a linear fashion. This fellowship has opened my eyes to the benefits of integrating research into my lifelong medical career, and global health will be part of that. Another story is Jerry Bloomfield from Duke, one of our first cardiologists to go out and do global cardiology. He went to Moi University in Eldoret, Kenya, set up a program on heart failure and markers of atherosclerosis, and had an amazing experience. When he came back, he got an NIH K award to begin his research career in academics. He started getting fellows who he sent to Kenya to do cardiology. He found a donor to Duke who put in a cardiovascular clinic and a 14-bed unit in Kenya. And now the elder professors of cardiology from Duke are making rotations at that site. All of this happened, and training Kenyan physicians and young researchers, all of this happened as an offshoot of a single Fogarty Fellow now in practice. An amazing return on investment and an outpost for cardiovascular research for the United States. And Kogi Naidu, a fellow who went to Caprisa to work. She's now directs the treatment research program at their AIDS center and has really grown up to be an outstanding investigator. In addition, she writes, in addition to reducing suffering from the disease itself, I wanted to go and do something to alleviate the helplessness and frustration that pervades medical service in South Africa, and she's become a real leader. At Fogarty, we also build international relations, and here you just see a number of relations being built with India in biomedical engineering, in Myanmar, with the World Health Summit with leaders, and here with the Princess of Thailand. Lots of international relations that extend the reach of all of NIH and all of the U.S. biomedical community. Well, I want to also finally, in closing, direct you to our website, which is loaded with information about the Fogarty Center, fic.nih.gov. Here's that story about the Alzheimer's families being treated, protecting against the Ebola response in West Africa, thinking about the Fulbright-Fogarty connection, linking the State Department and Health and Human Services on the training of young people in global health. Ebola's unseen mental scars, our first fellows going to the Ebola-affected countries to deal with the aftermath and training and around research, and ultimately thinking about why we're here, why Fogarty exists, and what are the benefits of the Fogarty contribution to global health research. It's really in saving lives and improving health. It's addressing the economic impact of what we do for the U.S. economy and beyond for diagnostics, drugs, vaccines, and concepts. It's for the safety and security of Americans, extending the frontiers of research abroad, and to extend and accelerate progress in research. It's really for our own future. It's the right thing to do. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Roger. This is Bob Bollinger from Johns Hopkins, and it's my great pleasure to be here as well, and greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk about our 25 years of experience working with the Fogarty program in India, which has really been a highlight of my own career, and I think has really created tremendous opportunities for our Hopkins faculty, students, as well as, I'll say later, many others around the world. So as I mentioned, I've been working with Fogarty for 25 years to help train many scientists, more than 2,000 scientists trained through this program in India over that period of time, with more than 100 who've actually come to Hopkins for specialized degree training, getting their M.P.H, Ph.D s. And one of the questions we always ask ourselves is, are we, by training people from foreign countries here, contributing to the brain drain? And I can tell you that of all of our graduates, I know of only 3 that have not gone back to India work. 2 of them actually work at the CDC in Atlanta, and 1 is a WHO consultant. So Fogarty alumni are both Indian and global health leaders, and we'll say more about why that's important. Our research team currently, after this investment, has more than 150 researchers and staff in India, with many, many students, many Indian medical students and graduate students. At Hopkins, we have more than 50 Hopkins faculty and staff working with our colleagues in India, and again, with many Hopkins students having that opportunity. So while we have been engaged for 25 years at Hopkins, this opportunity we've been involved in has provided connections and research opportunities for students and faculty at other U.S. universities. So we collaborate with many of them. I just listed a few there. So it's not just Hopkins that benefits, but many other U.S. universities. We've been able, because of that investment, to be contributing significantly to the research in HIV initially. And the first studies that looked at the epidemic of HIV in India, this was one of the first papers in the British Medical Journal in 1995, was describing the risk factors for HIV for the first time in India. All of the highlighted people there on that first publication are Fogarty alumni, including the first author, Dr. Jeanette Rodericks. Since that time, Fogarty's program in India has contributed significantly to HIV research broadly. We did some of the first studies looking at the relationship between sexually transmitted diseases and HIV risk. We showed early on that circumcision was associated with decreased risk of HIV. We've shown that maternal tuberculosis is associated with increased risk of mother-to-child transmission. We were one of the lead sites with the SWEN study that's highlighted there in the bottom left, published in Lancet, which is the 6-week extended dose nevirapine to prevent breast milk transmission of HIV that ultimately led to changes in the WHO global guidelines. We've involved in the study, the HPTN-052, which I think Chris will say more about in a moment. And early on, we did some of the first cloning and sequencing of the HIV genome. Shown up on the left is a journal virology paper, which I'm told by the journal is in the top 20 most cited articles in the Journal of Virology in the last 20 years. The highlighted folks there are also Fogarty alumni from that paper as well. We've done studies on the immune response to HIV and have been involved with many NIH-funded HIV networks. All in all, more than 200 publications have come out of this collaboration, which has also been a product of many NIH and CDC grants over the years, none of which would have happened without the initial Fogarty investment in our people and our colleagues. And while we've certainly been involved in a lot of HIV work, Roger illustrated earlier an example of how we can leverage that investment for many other things which are important to the United States. So we have more than 60 current projects right now, and I've just listed a few examples which I think have particular relevance to the United States and beyond, looking at the intersection of tuberculosis and COPD, diabetes and TB. We're looking at microbiome studies with HIV and TB. The mobile health projects that we have in India are also interesting. Roger showed you a picture of Eliota from Uganda, a Fogarty scholar. We have a Fogarty scholar that's working on a mobile health project in India that is using technology developed with Eliota in Uganda 8 years ago. That's not only benefiting India but the Ugandan solution that he helped us develop has now led to a startup company in Baltimore that's hired, I think, 12 people already and providing a direct economic benefit in the United States beyond just the public health benefit, just showing you how these global connections can be leveraged. We're also doing studies of important diseases like influenza, dengue, and chikungunya, and if you live in South Florida or Texas, you know why this is important. And finally, we've begun to do a lot more on antimicrobial resistance and what we learn in India about the treatment of sepsis in adults and children with proper antibiotic stewardship, looking at the nosocomial transmission of antibiotic-resistant diseases in the hospital settings in India. And of course, the drug-resistant tuberculosis epidemic is critical. In India, they have more than 100,000 annual cases of drug-resistant tuberculosis. Our medical students, our residents of Hopkins, go to India to learn how to deal with this problem. So when they come back here, they're more quickly equipped and better equipped and trained to manage patients here right in the United States. As Roger said, our focus is training the next generation. And I want to say something more about why it's important to the U.S. Students. We have an opportunity for our Fogarty programs to expose our U.S. scientists and our U.S. students to really unique problems and cultures that really benefit them when they come back home to the United States, even if they don't end up in global health as a permanent career. 40% of the Johns Hopkins medical students spend time overseas during their medical school. Why do they do that? Because they know that they'll be better doctors when they come back. Where do they go? They go to visit and spend time with our Fogarty trainees and our Fogarty scholars and partnerships. That's where they learn how to become better doctors back here in the United States. Working in those resource settings encourages novel solutions that they bring back to Baltimore and beyond. These international partnerships help us ensure that we remain competitive in the United States and provide the best care for our own patients as well. I want to take a bit of a side note and use another example which I think really illustrates the point Roger was talking about and how important this investment is. Thank goodness Fogarty invested in Latin America over the years, because for those of you who are interested and concerned about Zika infection, and you should be, particularly if you are or know someone who's pregnant in the United States, we now know, unfortunately, that 1 in 10 pregnant women in the United States with Zika infection have babies with birth defects. This is a huge concerning priority for public health. But thank goodness we have investigators and alumni from the Fogarty program in South America that are helping us investigate solutions to that problem now. We can wait and solve that problem here, or we can help our colleagues who are supported by Fogarty to solve the problem there and benefit ourselves as well. A good example is Dr. Caspia, who is a Fogarty alum, who's actually one of the investigators leading the current vaccine trials for the Zika vaccine candidates in Peru. And again, thank goodness he's there to help us develop a vaccine as soon as we can that will benefit our communities right here in the United States. So in conclusion, I would just like to add to what Roger said by saying that we really benefit from this incredible highly productive investment that Fogarty has provided us. Fogarty-trained alumni are the partners, the colleagues and leaders, and the global health experts that we in the United States need to help us address these future pandemics, as well as to help guide the care and prevention of disease right here in the United States. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Chris, and happy to answer questions.
Well, thanks very much, Bob, and I'd like to thank the organizers, Research America and IDSA, and just say what an honor it is to be here also with Roger Glass, who's been such a terrific leader of the Fogarty International Center. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about the role that Fogarty has played in supporting the international HIV/AIDS collaborative research effort and how important that has been to iconic programs like PEPFAR and the Global Fund, and which of course have been really at the center of U.S. support for the HIV/AIDS response. At Hopkins, we had Fogarty funding through what was called the ATERPs, the AIDS International Training and Research Programs, which ran for 25 years, really at the center of Fogarty's mission. Altogether, over 1,400 people were trained through that Hopkins program in HIV/AIDS research across the gamut of research, clinical, basic, prevention, and in a number of the countries that have turned out to be really at the center both of the AIDS epidemic and of the responses to HIV. Uganda, Malawi, Ethiopia, and South Africa being the main ones in Africa, but also China, India, which you just heard about from Bob, Thailand, and Russia. And these have led these training programs to ongoing international HIV collaborations in all of those countries, although Russia is less active now. And these research partnerships have been a part of virtually every major breakthrough in HIV. And it is really extraordinary when you look at that track record. One colleague of mine described Fogarty as the glue that holds the international HIV collaborations together. I think that's right. I think that's accurate. So just a couple of examples that our Fogarty collaborations and trainees were involved in that first study that showed that single-dose nevirapine could prevent transmission from mother to babies in Uganda. The landmark HPTN-052 trial that I'm going to talk about in some detail. Again, our Hopkins collaborative sites with Fogarty support were in Malawi, Thailand, and India. That study, as I'll tell you about, has really changed the world in HIV. Another study that changed the world was the first study to show that you could prevent HIV acquisition with pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. That involved the Hopkins sites in Thailand and South Africa. And then, of course, of the many HIV vaccine trials that have been out there, only one has showed any efficacy in human volunteers. That was the RV144 trial in Thailand that was joint with the Thai Ministry of Health, U.S. military research program, and the NIH. But many of the Thais who worked on that were trainees of our program, and the man who led the recruitment effort, Dr. Jirsak, was our Fogarty lead in Thailand. And there are just many examples. You've heard a number. I'm going to just maybe talk about two people, or two or three, who came out of this training program. One that we're really delighted about is a young Burmese Myanmar physician named Dr. Sonang. He was a trainee of ours and then tried to go home and work. It was very challenging to keep collaborations going. That country was very closed. But in 2011, they had a political opening, and he was one of the first people that we heard from, and we now have a large AMFAR-funded collaboration, and he is the director of the International HIV/AIDS Alliance in Myanmar and has very quickly emerged as a leader in that effort. That would have been impossible without Fogarty. He got an M.P.H. at Hopkins through the grant. Dr. Suwat, who is the lead of our Thai research site in Chiang Mai, was the Thai principal investigator on HPTN-052 and also on the IPREX trial. So two of the truly landmark trials in HIV prevention. So I won't go into all these in detail. I'm just going to highlight a few, but let me just say that David Surwata, who was a Ugandan lead investigator, ended up being one of the key people in the circumcision trials. Uganda was where those trials were done, which demonstrated about a 60% protection for men who'd been circumcised from sexual acquisition of HIV infection. That's really extraordinary landmark. And of course, HPTN-052, which I'm going to talk about next, is a great example of treatment as prevention. So what is this study and why is it so important? Well, this was a very large, multi-country international trial that involved the U.S., but also many partners, including our Fogarty partners in Malawi, Thailand, and India. And basically the question was, does earlier treatment for HIV infection reduce onward transmission of the virus. So this required enrolling what are called discordant couples, where either the man or the woman, or in a same-sex couple, one of the two men, was living with HIV. The partner was uninfected, and the idea was, would earlier initiation of treatment for those folks living with HIV reduce the likelihood of their partners becoming infected? So does treatment have a prevention benefit? And this trial, which is a big, complicated, expensive undertaking, turned out to have a spectacular outcome. There was a more than 90% reduction in transmission. There were also clinical benefits to the people who were started early. And we learned from this that there was a tremendous, potent prevention impact to earlier treatment. And that has led to the movement to really change the guidelines worldwide, and now to be in a position where WHO and virtually every other government out there in the world has agreed on immediate initiation of therapy. And it is this insight which has led people to the optimism that we have about an AIDS-free generation and about the potential to actually get control of the HIV epidemic. So the word landmark study gets overused. This is a landmark study, and it has really changed the way we understand the epidemic. That has also meant, of course, that Fogarty laid an incredibly important part of the foundation for the success of PEPFAR. PEPFAR has been called one of the most successful development and health programs worldwide. It's the largest investment in a single disease in human history, so it's something extraordinary to be proud of. It should be pointed out that this was initiated in 2003 under then President George Bush. It has maintained strong bilateral support from Democrats and Republicans, from both President Bush and President Obama. It continues to be a program which has literally saved millions of lives, had a huge impact on turning around the catastrophic AIDS epidemic in Africa. And Eric Gooseby, the man in the photo there, who was for many years the PEPFAR director and the U.S. Global AIDS coordinator, really made the point that it's the NIH and the Fogarty platform that has been fundamental to laying out the science that underpins a PEPFAR. People talk about PEPFAR as an incredibly successful program, but part of that is because the drugs that we have come out of clinical trials that are so effective, and of course because we've been able to turn insights into the study like HBTN052 into policy through the PEPFAR platform. So when you think about, for example, potential threats to Fogarty or to the NIH, and that somehow you could leave PEPFAR alone, that's a misunderstanding of how this actually works. The research investments and the capacity building for that research are part of what has allowed this program to be so successful, and will continue to be, because there is an iterative process to doing the research that's necessary to keep refining the program and keep it informed by the best science we have. I'll just make one or two other points. In Thailand, where we have been active now for 25 years, we were delighted last year with the announcement that Thailand had successfully eradicated mother-to-child transmission of HIV. I can tell you that when I was working there in the early 90s, we had thousands of babies born with HIV every year. It was heartbreaking. It is extraordinary that we are now talking about successful eradication. That's a problem that Thais now really have to invest much less in. That is a win for everybody. And of course, Thailand is such an important U.S. strategic ally. The HIV programs with our military allies include not just Thailand, but of course Ethiopia and Uganda. And I would finally say that Dr. Glass talked early on about the importance of bioethics training. Hopkins has had for many years a bioethics training program for African scientists. That has been absolutely essential to not only helping build out the research infrastructure, but allow it to maintain those highest protections for human subjects and volunteers. That's essential. We need to see that. We need to continue it. So I will stop there. I think Christine Lubinski of IDSA is next. And let me just say what an honor it is to talk about this extraordinary program.
Thank you all for sharing the important work that Fogarty supports. We will now, before we go to Christine, we will now open up for a brief Q&A session. Again, please, if you have questions, type them into the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. And our first question is, what roles do Fogarty trainees have in addressing outbreaks?
Great. Well, let me just begin. You know, going back to my comment on that outbreak of Ebola, in places like Nigeria, Ghana, Mali, the people who were knowledgeable and connected to the world and could contact people to learn what to do with an Ebola outbreak, that had the containment equipment, the knowledge of public health practices, they were really able to act. And even if they hadn't seen Ebola in the past, they knew the basic principles of infectious diseases that they had learned through these programs. So in those settings, I think the untold story of the Ebola outbreak is that if we didn't have those people in place, the outbreak would have gone much further. So that's really, it's in the prevention of the outbreaks initially in those countries that were not as affected, if you will, but also in the future to enable countries to prevent the outbreaks when they occur, whatever they might be.
The only thing I would add to what Roger said is, as we, I think all three said, the Fogarty Alumni Network, if you will, is global, highly trained, partnering very closely with U.S. Agencies and U.S. universities, and in many ways are our boots on the ground. Not only are they there to improve the health of their own communities, but when these outbreaks occur, whether it be influenza or Ebola or Zika or dengue or chikungunya or antimicrobial resistance, what they learn about how to deal with that epidemic in their own communities has direct relevance to us here in the United States.
Thank you. So our next question is, how can Fogarty help in career transition for experienced professionals?
Well, we have, for experienced professionals, we have a series of grants and programs for both U.S. and foreign investigators to become engaged in global health research. So if it's transitioning from a U.S. position to working in global health, there are opportunities available. I mentioned the FIC, the Fogarty website, which lists all the opportunities for training, research, and networking that are available through all of NIH. And I would say also that we are working with all the NIH institutes to extend their activities in the global health agenda and to provide new training opportunities where they hadn't existed before. You know, in the past century, global health was primarily infectious diseases. Now that we're thinking about the non-communicable disease agenda, trauma and the like, we really need experts in some of these other areas as well. And that's why in my presentation, I highlighted, for instance, the interest in cardiovascular disease, stroke, which is the #1 cause of death in the world, cancer, stroke, and environmental hazards and mental illness. So there's a lot that we can do to build out. And I think this is a unique opportunity for Fogarty dealing with the breadth of training in global health. It really extends the frontiers of biomedical research around the world and ensures the leadership of the United States in research for years to come.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question, and that is, what makes Fogarty unique from other global health organizations?
Yeah, I think the investment in what's most important, and that's people. That's the skills, the competencies, and the leadership skills necessary to not only discover what we need to discover about health in the future, but to improve the care and prevention of diseases all over the world right now. So it's the investment in the training of the individuals, of the people, and creating this international network of leaders that I really think is very, very unique and important. Every April 15th, I complain about paying my taxes, except when I think about Fogarty, because I've seen how my tax dollars are being spent, and I have no hesitation when I think about some of that money spent on this program. It's a great investment for us as well.
I would just add, this is Chris, that I think one of the things that's really unique is the sustained nature of that collaboration and training. So, many of the agencies that are out there offer short-term training, what we used to call hotel training, 2 or 3 days in a hotel in a capital city. And, when you think about your own career, I didn't get my training in public health in 3 days in a hotel. I got it by getting a master's in public health at Johns Hopkins. So that is something that Fogarty has been able to offer people, both from the U.S. and internationally. And that is really the game changer that helps people really become leaders and contributors. And Fogarty has been very unique in supporting and sustaining that longer-term real career development that others have been very limited in doing.
Great, thank you. And now we will turn it over to Christine.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to participate. So I'm just going to begin with summarizing, I think, some of the many important points that have been made by Dr. Glass and Drs. Bollinger and Beyrer, the sort of major functions of Fogarty, that it funds studies to help predict and contain pandemics, builds local capacity, cultivates global health leadership, supports the work of U.S. universities with the overwhelming majority of its funds, expands human resources for NIH research, collaborates with other NIH institutes to amplify impact, which is another thing that I think makes it different from other global research entities, that it's nested in NIH, builds partnerships between health institutions in the U.S. and abroad, and fosters goodwill and U.S. leadership globally. As you heard, and clearly this is not a complete list because there were a number of health conditions and issues referenced by the previous speaker that went beyond this list: influenza, the bioethics training. I think it's fair to say, for those of us who conduct research, represent those who do, and do research advocacy, that Fogarty's work covers the landscape of scientific and research priorities. So the elephant in the room is that this vital, life-saving, modestly funded program has been proposed for elimination in the president's budget. And many of us spent all day Tuesday trying to grapple with the administration's budget request for the programs near and dear to our heart, including overall funding for the NIH. So I think we could all take comfort in this comment by Senator Mike Enzi, who's actually chair of the Senate Budget Committee, which is that the president's budget is a suggestion. We will take a close look, but Congress is mandated by the Constitution with key spending responsibilities and will ultimately decide what the nation's fiscal priorities will be. So next step, Congress. In terms of the work we all have looking ahead to preserve Fogarty as a vital public and global resource. So the good news is that we know that Fogarty enjoys bipartisan support. The current funding bill for this fiscal year actually contains a modest increase for Fogarty, which was reflected in both the House and Senate versions of Republican-led funding bills. We know, and I'll talk about this some more, that bipartisan support for the center was voiced at a hearing just a little less than a week ago. And I included this quote from Bloomberg News because I thought it was instructive. Trump wants science cuts and Congress responds with a portrait. And this really reflects comments made by Congressman Tom Cole at a hearing at NIH at the Labor HHS subcommittee in the House, where he talked about how spurred, sort of inspired by a meeting with Mary McAndrew, who is actually John Fogarty's daughter, the namesake for the Fogarty International Center, he did some research and found out that, in fact, John Fogarty had been a leader in the Congress for decades and had chaired the House Labor HHS subcommittee, and he talked about his interest in getting a portrait of John Fogarty to hang in the hearing room of the subcommittee that makes decisions about NIH funding, including Fogarty, on an annual basis. So, and we've heard, again, at that same hearing, some incredibly inspired support about Fogarty. On the left is Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who's actually the ranking Democratic member of the subcommittee, who was quite vocal about her support for Fogarty at the hearing, saying that it represents only a sliver of the NIH budget, but has an outsized impact on the prevention and mitigation of outbreaks in the world. Their work helps ensure diseases are quickly contained and never reach our country. On the right, you have Congressman Tom Cole, who has been vocal in his general support for global health research and security, and who said, you're much more likely to die in a pandemic than you are in a terrorist attack. I'd much rather fight Ebola in West Africa than in West Dallas. And finally, well known to all of us who care about research, Tony Fauci was asked by Congresswoman DeLauro about Fogarty in this same hearing, and said, Fogarty trainees around the world are our brothers and sisters working in partnership to contain Ebola outbreaks, conduct Zika vaccine trials, and address other global threats, which encapsulates many of the themes we've talked about, from human resource development to pandemic preparedness. But notwithstanding those comments, I think those of us who have been having conversations with people on Capitol Hill know that in many circles, Fogarty is still a well-kept secret. And we have a great deal of basic education to do. Programs that members don't hear about may get short shrift when funding decisions are made. And I think those of us who work in Washington know that it's going to be a long, arduous budget-making process this year. And decisions may be made by a handful of people in a room at the 11th hour. And it is just very important for all of us to communicate with our congressional representatives about Fogarty. It doesn't matter what committee your senator and House member sits on. We need to do basic education about this program and its value. We need to integrate messages about Fogarty into our advocacy for NIH overall. And for those of us who do global health, as Chris Beyrer and others indicated, there is a direct correlation between Fogarty's value as a research enterprise and as a training enterprise and the continuing success of life-saving global health programs. So many of us are going to be out there fighting for another increase for NIH, fighting against cuts to global AIDS, TB, malaria, and the like. And those are very important opportunities to also talk about Fogarty. You can meet with your member of Congress at home. For those of you who don't work here, you might be interested to know they work an average of about 3.5 days a week here. So they're actually home in the state, in the district often. And those are often incredible opportunities for you and your colleagues to schedule a meeting, and a valuable opportunity to potentially have real face time with members themselves, although staff remain incredibly influential and valuable. As you heard today from Dr. Bollinger and Dr. Beyrer, we need to share stories about the benefits of Fogarty to U.S. investigators, what it has meant to their careers, and the U.S. economy as well as global health. Thanks to Research America and others, we now know a great deal more about the economic engine that NIH research provides in states across the country, and Fogarty is a part of that message as well. So thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions along with my other colleagues here.
Thank you, Christine. So we do have time for one question, and that is, what types of messages are the most compelling to use on the Hill or to our members?
Well, I think some of the powerful messages depend on who your audience is. So to the extent to which you can find out about the priorities of your elected representative, for instance, which health conditions are important to those, if they're a real advocate for Alzheimer's research, stressing Fogarty's contribution there would be important. In general, I think the global security arguments are very compelling. We currently have an outbreak of Ebola in the Congo. I mean, we literally have gone from one outbreak to the next. And I think with Ebola and with Zika, Americans and American policymakers understand that major infectious disease outbreaks are really just a plane ride away from the United States. So I think those are compelling arguments as well.
Great, and unfortunately that is our time, but if you did have questions that we were unable to get to, there is contact information appearing on your screen right now. Please feel free to reach out to us, and if you'd like to reach the Fogarty Center directly with questions, please send them to Research America, Rachel Wiseman. Her email address is on your screen at the bottom. Thank you all very much for tuning in to the webinar this afternoon. There will be a recording available shortly after today's program. And thank you to the Infectious Diseases Society of America and the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene for your support in this webinar. Have a great day.